Dear guests, thank you for attending this panel discussion, pen and paper dissection with our guest of honor, Alexander Fried, and Andrija Frlan from the Association Kulturni Front. Feel free to ask any questions and to comment, because this is a panel discussion. And now please welcome our guests.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for coming, and let's start. So the first, we're going to share this mic, so it's going to be a bit weird, but don't sweat it. So the first topic, let's say, is the influence of pen and paper on us. How did you get into it? And well, since we are here, obviously had some influence. So could you start with that?
Sure. So I first got into pen and paper role-playing games when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. Oddly enough, my elementary school library used to get issues of Dragon magazine, the magazine that TSR put out for Dungeons and Dragons and reviews of other industry stuff. And I had never played any Dungeons and Dragons, but I picked up the magazine and it was amazing and it had cool dragons on the cover. And that sort of got the ball rolling. As I got older, I played different sorts of games. Finally, long before I started writing video games and novels and comic books and the stuff that I do today, I wrote pen and paper role-playing games for a living for a good couple of years. That was back in the days during the D20 boom in the early 2000s, and I wrote a lot of rule supplements and setting supplements and that sort of thing. And I don't really write pen and paper stuff professionally anymore, but I still play whenever I get the chance, and I still have a love for the form.
Excellent. We're gonna ask a bit more questions about the experience of writing the stuff. I'm playing more or less continually for the last 20 years. So you started a bit younger. I was 15, but still I'm really proud that my role-playing experience, both as DM and lately, thankfully, as a player, it's a lot easier to prepare as a player than as a DM. So not for us personally, but for the world, perhaps more important question is the influence of pen and paper games on art, on media. What do you see? Where are the biggest influences on books, on movies, on music, whatever? Obviously on video games, but it's just translating from one media to the other. It's not as simple as something a bit more tricky.
So I think this is a really interesting one. We look at sort of the first role-playing games as we recognize them as coming about in the early 1970s, which means that it's now been well over 40 years since this medium, this movement kind of started. You've got a whole generation of authors and screenwriters and musicians and so forth who have now grown up knowing Dungeons and Dragons and World of Darkness and these other role-playing games their entire lives. And you can see it come out in their work in interesting sorts of ways. So one of the examples that I like to go to for this is when you look at fantasy novels and you look at the way that magic is described in fantasy novels. So many books these days now have magic as this detailed system, and spells have rules about how you can cast them and what effects they interfere with them and where the source of magical power is. And that's something that I think really comes from pen and paper role-playing games, because you needed to come up with these systems in order to let player characters use magic. But if you look back at Tolkien, Gandalf didn't have a magic system. If you look back at, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea novels, or The Last Unicorn, or the Conan stories, right? Magic was this very mysterious and weird thing that almost by definition had no rules. And we see a lot of places where pen and paper rules are kind of coming to play in interesting ways. And I could keep babbling on, but I'm going to give you a chance to join in.
Yeah, I actually read several books when combat, which should not be described in pen and paper mechanics, was described in pen and paper mechanics. So you had, now this guy does this, and then this guy does this. So I like magic, having rules, having structure, but to have that mechanic feeling of stuff that should be really random is not as nice. Well, going into all that, pen and paper, actually role-playing games have become a bit more mainstream. Do you think that the position of the nerd is different today than it was, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago? Or are nerds still those weird kids that play silly stuff?
I think it's actually a little bit of both. Nerds are still the silly kids who play weird stuff, but they're also more accepted at the same time. And I think the pen and paper nerds are, in particular, in a bit of an odd place, because Game of Thrones is one of the most popular shows on television, which says something about how accepted fantasy has become in the mainstream world, and how far sort of nerds and nerd literature have come over the years. But on the other hand, you don't see a lot of actual role-playing games in the wider world either. I think they may be more accepted, but they're not more played. You look back at the 1980s when Dungeons and Dragons was a force in the world. You could buy Dungeons and Dragons toys in your local toy store. At least in the US you could. There was a Saturday morning Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. And nowadays people know about Dungeons and Dragons, and they know what it is, and they maybe, sort of have some understanding of, wait, isn't that game that's kind of like, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and those things? But I'm not sure it has been integrated into the rest of the world the way certain other, fantasy literature and science fiction have. But maybe you have another point of view on that.
Well, in the 80s, you couldn't buy anything Dungeons and Dragons in Croatia. So, yeah, I do have a bit different view. I believe that even playing role-playing games is more accepted. And, well, World of Warcraft is a role-playing game, and a lot of people play that. So there is a type of role-playing game that's really mainstream, because computer games are mainstream. However, pen and paper variation of the role-playing games is still stuff for, well, weird kids. Yeah, sorry? Yeah.
I just want to add something quickly to that. So I hadn't really been thinking about this before, but it's interesting to imagine a world where video games did not kind of replace pen and paper games in the mainstream. And I wonder how much credit we have to give video games for helping to bring fantasy and science fiction into the mainstream. Did they have nothing to do with it? If it was just the Lord of the Rings movies and Star Wars and Game of Thrones that sort of helped broaden the appeal of this material and video games had never existed, would pen and paper role-playing games be incredibly popular now the way video games are? And I don't know the answer to it, but it's interesting to try to trace the cause and effect of all those things, because they all influence each other and the markets are all competing. I don't know, that's just talking through thoughts in my head.
Well, I believe Warcraft actually predates a lot of that things. It was first big fantasy games or really popular fantasy games. So I don't think that people would play something that actually requires a lot of effort. And that is the distinction between pen and paper and games, computer games. It's a lot easier to just put this CD or download it from Steam. You don't even have to put anything inside. The population that plays, you have a bit different experience. You said that Dungeons and Dragons was forced. TSR did bankrupt, so they did not create the content that people wanted to buy in sufficient matter. And now I believe Hasbro is owner of Wizards of the Coast, and they are the biggest game maker. So do you believe that globally, I'm sure that Dungeons and Dragons are a less unfamiliar term globally than it was 20 years ago. And I believe that the population that plays role-playing games is a bit bigger. I mean, we didn't have Liburnicon 20 years ago. We didn't have any cons 30 years ago. So in America, of course, the whole thing started, but it crept over the world a bit slower, I believe. So you had the big boom and then flatline practically. Or was it some signs of life in between, I don't know, late 80s and early 2000s?
Yeah, I had not thought about sort of the global reach of role-playing games and how that factors into the rise and fall of the industry. And I think something that relates to that a little bit as well is the increase in electronic publishing. So, the fact that you can get, you can go download an ebook of, the rules for your favorite pen and paper game back when, compare that to after the D&D boom in the 80s kind of collapsed, when it was very difficult to find a place to buy role-playing games in the US, and I imagine certainly no easier out here. Whereas now we are in a position where there is some global awareness of the market and the sort of games that they are, and pretty much anyone at least has a way to buy them now. And I don't know the net effect on the, I'm sure Hasbro has done some very expensive and very secret customer research in order to figure out exactly how many customers there are out there and where they are in the world. But I think that will probably continue to change as ebook publishing continues to grow, and certainly new ways of playing grow as well, because the market is always affected by whether or not you actually have groups of people playing together. And as more people are playing over Skype, over the internet, that's got to eventually have effects on the market as well.
Okay. we exhausted this topic a bit. So if you have any questions or any thoughts about this, the influence of pen and paper role-playing games on other media, now would be a great time to raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you. No. Okay. So you said that you actually wrote supplements for D20 games, and one of the topics is excellent for a segue to that. It's modules versus homemade. So do you first let's talk about your experience and what was important when you were creating the modules, whether they were you said rules modules and setting modules, right? So what was important in one, what was important in the other, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I wrote a number. So I wrote some straight adventure modules. I wrote some just books of pure sort of setting lore with some light mechanics attached. I wrote a surprisingly large number of just pure monster books for D20. There was a lot of people out there who liked monsters, and they're fun to write, honestly. So I covered a fairly broad spectrum of that sort of material. For me personally, I find that the older I get, the more likely I am to use a pre-made module or to just entirely make things up as I go with maybe like a couple of sketchy one-line notes of players go into the sewers to find the were-rat king, and then just come up with the rest of it as I go and try to watch my players for, well, are they enjoying this? Do we need to move on to something else? Is this working? Okay, they seem happy. We'll stay in the sewers for a while. But finding that middle ground of like the beautifully customized homemade module is something that just, it's so time consuming, and it's wonderful when it's done well, but it's really hard to do, and it's hard to find the time to run a game, let alone to put in 20 hours of prep work for it. And I think again in this age when you've got 300 modules available for download in a heartbeat for, you know, a relatively small price off, you know, drive-through RPG, it gets to the point where, yeah, well, maybe I'm just going to look for a module that's close to what I want to do, and I'll just buy that and it's there, because somewhere out there, somewhere in the vast collection of old Dungeons and Dragons modules and third-party stuff, somewhere there is a sewer involving a were-rat king, and I can just customize it for my players. So that's kind of where I've been falling in recent years. But what about you?
Well, I believe it's a lot easier to DM a game of a module badly. Because a good module has a lot of details that you forget, because the time is the main constraint, right? So when you download the module in a couple of hours, you have to go. So you read it once, you read it twice, and that's it. And if you have really inquisitive players, then ask, oh, what's that? What's that? What's that? What's that? And those are missing pieces. Then if you have to make them up as you go, sooner or later something will break, will not be. Whereas when you have a proper homebrew, when you did everything yourself, you know all the stuff that's behind. And it's really nice feeling as DM when you can say, oh yeah, that's because of that, and that. So yeah, if there weren't time constraints, I would prefer my own modules, my own adventures. But however, no, I don't mind. But I would like to get you back to talk about your experience of writing the stuff. What was important? What was
So one of the things you mentioned about figuring out description for something in a given module, that was something that I always found kind of difficult when writing modules. Is every group kind of has their own tolerance for, you know, we'll give a Dungeons and Dragons example. If you're in a dungeon and you go into a new room, how long do you want that description to be? And different groups are going to have different tolerances for that. Some people want the 3 paragraphs of detailed description of the room, and you can put that in the module and know that people will like it. Other groups want like 1 sentence, and then they can go around trying to decide how they're going to handle it. And when you're writing a module and you want this to be as readily accessible and useful to the DM as possible, you want to give them that block of text that they can just read. You don't want to try to scatter that in a bunch of different sections within the room. But what do you give them? Do you give them the short version? Do you give them the long version? And that's something that a pre-built module can never do. Is it can't be written to a style that fits your group. It might fit their adventuring style. You can have a module that has lots of diplomacy versus lots of combat, and if you're selling that module as a company, you try to make it clear what the purpose of this module is. Is it an old school dungeon crawl? Is it a diplomacy module? Fine, you can handle that, but you can't customize it so that it works with the actual play style rather than the adventuring or gameplay style.
okay? Good. Play styles. There are players that like to bash in the doors, bash in the heads, take the loot, and go away. There are players that like to, try to open the doors really slowly and go really carefully about, try to seduce the orc, and so on and so on. In your experience, did you ever manage to gel those play styles to make it work? And the other sub-question is the role of mechanics. Do mechanics have a say on how a game will be played? Will the players try to enforce their style over it? Or is the mechanics, okay, you can do that, you can't do that, and that's why we're going to play this type of game?
So players will always try to enforce their style of play on top of the mechanics. They won't always succeed, but they will always try. And sometimes it'll come back around. Sometimes the mechanics will start to influence their play style as well. But you look at, Dungeons and Dragons has always been the biggest and most popular game, and different editions of Dungeons and Dragons, of course, have sort of encouraged slightly different play styles. But you can see, everyone who grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, 2nd edition in the late 80s and 90s, those groups did not all play the game the same way. We can see that those experiences were incredibly different and incredibly diverse, because people play the games that they want to play, and the only problem there is the game may not actually be all that good for that play style. So if you're trying to play something that isn't built for the style of play that you're working with, you may just have less fun than you could if you were playing a different game. Now, figuring out what this style that if you're writing a game, figuring out what style that game supports, how to communicate it to the audience so that they don't try to do something with your game that just isn't going to be very fun for them. That's a difficult task. And also figuring out how broad a spectrum of experiences you want to write for is another issue. So, the module example is a little simpler, right? You can do, this is the traditional dungeon crawl module. It will give you a very specific experience that everyone knows what a dungeon crawl is like. You're going to go into room after room, and there's going to be an encounter in each one, and a lot of the times it's going to be fighting, and a lot of the times it's going to be traps. Everyone knows what they're getting if they buy one of those modules. But if you're building, a fantasy game or, an urban fantasy game like Vampire or Mage, or something that's not quite as identifiable, how much control do you want to give players and DMs over not just the experience that they have, but what kind of experience they want to have? And then when you're writing rules for them, how do you break that out? Do you want to have a ton of optional rules sidebars to say, hey, if you want a more combat-heavy game, here's an optional rule for how to handle that. I think that can work really well, but if you do it too much, then you've just got a book full of optional rules rather than a coherent vision in its own right. I'm rambling a little now, so if you want to jump in.
Just a second.
I'm sorry, but we have a question.
Just a second. This was really funny, and I'm going to say it. D20s did a whole book on optional rules, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another. So yeah, you don't have to have sidebars. You have new books. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask something, but actually, when I raised my arm, you started to explain the thing that I wanted to ask. Yeah, and, so I don't think that it's needed anymore to talk about it. But I wanted to ask just about this: how much can be if you change? We all know that rule that don't apply really to the way of how it really goes in the game or in the reality, and then this is really troublesome for the people that really like role play, because they really want to do the coup de grace, but it's not possible to do it. And it's really, yeah. So how much, maybe more from your experience, how much this can, I don't know, maybe even destroy the game, because all these rules in D&D in different versions and subversions, they are a lot tested, and I think that it's not just because the writer wanted to do it like this. Yeah, that the coup de grace really don't kill. Yeah, if it's not really a good role. Yeah, so I think that how much can this private rules destroy the game? Yeah, or maybe how much can it make it even better? Yeah, this was the question. Yes, hopefully you already answered it. So,
yeah. We did not forget that phrase. One of the first paragraphs in every player's handbook and DM's guide is have fun.
Excuse me. We have another question.
Yeah, just answer this one.
Okay.
The game is destroyed if the players don't have fun. Sometimes players just want to sit together around the table and have a laugh, kill a few orcs, and that's it. Sometimes players want to have really engaging adventure, really engaging character, really engaging encounters. And then, if you bring the relaxed rules, then the whole experience can be a bit less than it should be.
So what's your preference when writing modules? Do you like writing about the lore and the fluff, or about the crunch and the rules of the module?
So when I'm doing, so when you say module, I tend to think like adventure module rather than something sort of broader. Generally, I like doing the stuff that's somewhere in between. So my favorite stuff to write are the rules that really evoke a particular flavor or an idea. So the rules that you go, oh, yeah, I've never been able to, see something in a game that, that felt like that moment in a book or a movie, or wow, that's a rule from, that's a poison that this monster delivers that really has an interesting way of making my character feel weak. It's not just a stat being lowered, it's a stat being altered or an ability being altered in a really interesting way. And for me, that was always the most fun part of writing this stuff, was the middle ground where it's like, okay, yes, this isn't just pure lore, this isn't pure fluff, but it's about how that cool lore actually gets implemented in game.
Excuse me, you have another question?
I'd like to ask you a simple question regarding the writing of the modules. Now, we all know that role-playing games, by their very nature, they are really non-linear narratives. Players decide to go right instead of left, and everything falls apart. So when writing an adventure module, how do you strike a balance between allowing players some semblance of choice while simultaneously trying to somehow herd them toward the ending and the main villain and the climax of the story that you want them to go to? How do you in a written form, this is probably far more challenging than writing just a regular story.
Yeah, the answer to that one is it's really hard, and you hope that you do well. Part of it is a matter of making sure that you've got enough material early in the module to establish motivation for the characters. And some of that is on the DM as well. So it might be less about establishing the motivation within the module and more about giving the DM, hey, here are a bunch of ideas for why your players might want to go through this adventure. But if you can get the players, really, really angry with the villain of a module, then you can at least feel fairly confident that they're gonna at least try to get to that villain, right? They might try to do it in some roundabout way. They might decide, hey, let's leave the dungeon and let's find a way to create an earthquake so that it collapses on top of the villain. And at a certain point, there's not a lot you can do about that, because players are always going to come up with something ridiculous that you never foresaw. But you can try to at least get them pointed in the right direction and really wanting to play the module. And I think the more you get the players having fun and wanting to play the module in kind of the spirit that it was written, the more likely they are to mostly go at it the way that you wanted them to do. And of course, you also just need to build in as much wiggle room as you can. I think the wrong way to do it, or at least the way to overdo it, is to put in 1,000 reasons why the players can't do some clever way of solving the module. So again, giving the dungeon example just because it's an easy one to talk about, all these walls have, no teleport shielding in them, and there are anti-magic zones all above the dungeon that prevent you from putting an earthquake there. And right, like you can come up with ways to try to thwart every clever trick of the players, but you're not going to come up with all of them. And ultimately, you don't want to be in that war with the players in the first place. You either should be going, you know what? The players are going to have more tricks than we know what to deal with, so let's just try to write a module that says somehow the players are going to get from the top of the dungeon to the bottom of the dungeon with the villain, and it's okay however they want to do it. Or in other games, you just rely on the player having a limited set of tricks in the first place and motivating them to go along. There are, I know I'm rambling, but I'm going to keep going for just a little more. There are obviously games where what you have control of is so small. So a game like White Wolf's Mage, Mage the Ascension or Mage the Awakening, where players can do almost literally anything so long as they can gather enough power and have enough time. When you're writing a module like that, you really just sort of have to give them motivations and endpoints and go, you know what? We're not even going to write a step-by-step way that they are going to get to this next stage of the adventure. They're going to find a way. Here are some suggestions of how you as a DM should approach different player methodologies. But you know what? Just let the players do their thing. They're gonna have fun. They're gonna come up with something. Just guide them through it until you're at kind of a choke point in that adventure that they're going to get to along the line.
We like your ramblings. Yeah. There was a talk of destroying games, and now you said players can do whatever they want. And being able to do whatever you want is a nice thing. However, mostly player groups are actually player groups. It's one DM and several players. And sometimes what players want is to destroy other people's games. That's a problem when it's intentional. But I like to play a thief. And when I go into mansion or something like that, I want to explore it really well. And I want DM to give me a lot of details. What do I see? What do I smell? What do I hear? How can I crawl? How can I hide? And for me, that's splendid. That's really nice. However, other players are not enjoying it as much. Some other players really like their big talks with the Duchess and so on and so forth, and it's really boring. No, it's not. But how do you? It's not me. How do you manage to first, how do you balance DM's time in those situations? Well, it's obviously that only one player can do that. It's his role to go to the mansion and to steal the diamond and so on. So, how do you divide your time as a DM so everybody has fun?
I think there are kind of three different layers to how you can address that issue. And the first layer is just the game design itself. So in theory, games should be designed so that they're not encouraging a wild amount of extra time and sort of extra DM management for certain types of characters and less so for others. If you've got a game in which there are 4 different player classes and 3 of them all operate together incredibly well, and then the 4th is a total loner, then maybe that game ought to be designed a little differently. But that can only get you so far. Even in the best designed games, right? You're going to run into to issues in this regard, and that brings us to sort of the second layer of it, which is the player group level. So really, you can solve any problem if you've got good enough players who are into this game and cooperative enough. Again, that's an ideal, but hopefully you've at least got players that want to play the game together, where they're not constantly running off, and where they understand that there is a balance among the time that they're going to need, and are willing to give the spotlight to other players when the time comes. But again, assuming you've got a decent game, assuming you've got a decent party, you're still going to run into this problem at times. And there are, the basic ways to do that is just to try to find starring moments for all the players, but there are also ways of doing it either just as a DM or mechanically to get the other players involved during those periods. So, can you ask another player to sort of take a co-DM role and go, okay, well, if the thief is breaking into the mansion, you're going to get to play the guard for this scene, or, you're going to get to, do something clever mechanically. You're going to get to play the thief's contact in flashbacks that we're going to have along the line here. So every time you get to a new door, we're going to do like a little flashback scene where you get to coach the thief on what he's going to face or what he's going to see next. Right? There are ways of bringing other players into those scenes, and I think if you have a game where that is happening frequently, then you want to try to build that game around making sure that you've got roles for the other players in these sorts of scenes. At least if you don't, then you need players who are highly tolerant of sitting back and watching other players, having fun and playing the game, which can work in some circumstances. Like if you've got a player who is just magnificently entertaining, then sure, maybe that player gets a lot more spotlights than everyone. If that player is playing the thief and everyone else just loves watching him do his thing, sure, go for it. Again, it's always going to be dependent on the group, but yeah, it's never going to not be an issue, but there are a number of different ways to get around it.
Yeah. But if the group plays for more than 10 sessions, it gets really... okay, you're an author, you're a writer, so it's your job to come with different ideas. But for your normal DM, it's difficult to come with 2 solutions to a problem that's reoccurring problem. So I believe you said that could be a game balance design flaw. Okay, yeah. So thieves should go only to dodges, not to mentions, not alone. Okay. The semi-question is the balance between party members. Is it important? When is it? When it's really important, when it's not important? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm going to steal your answer to this. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, and the phrase that stuck in my head was, it's not about balance of power, it's not about balance of time even, it's about balance of fun, which I think is absolutely correct, which is why I'm not letting you say it and I'm saying it first. Haha. Because it is. Ultimately, it depends on the sort of game that you're playing and the sort of players that you've got. If you've got players who are super tactically oriented and it's a combat focused game, then yes, it's going to be pretty darn important that those characters have roughly equal proficiency in combat. Same is true if you've got a game that is all about diplomacy or spellcasting. Well, those players ought to be relatively similar in those sorts of abilities, or they're going to start to feel overshadowed. A lot of that is knowing what the game is about, right? This keeps coming up, but I'm a big proponent of playing a game that is pretty close to the game that you actually want to be playing. Don't try to twist Dungeons & Dragons second edition into something that is vastly different from the play style of your group, because you're going to be fighting it the whole way. And there are times that you do that because no one wants to learn a new rules system, but they do want to play a different style of game. And sure, you run with it, you try to figure it out. But you need to at least know what your players want and what's important to them. And if you've got a game system that is not balanced for what the players want, then that's something that you're going to be constantly fighting to achieve and having to make adjustments behind the scene. And you can do that, but it's never going to be ideal for you as a DM to have to take on that much work yourself.
So what we learned is that a wise man said it's balance of fun. Excellent. Today I found a brilliant research about metagaming rewards for the players. And I was so in love with the idea that I want to tell it to you, and then we're going to have last questions, and that's it. The idea is it's actually not important what the characters get, whether they get treasure, fame, whatever. But at the end of the day, do the players look at the DM and say, well, that was a good game? And the thing to realize that I realized just today, I'm a bit ashamed of that, but I realized it today, different players want different things from games. And sometimes it doesn't work. If somebody just wants to socialize and have fun, whereas some other players want really to go deep into the motivation of their characters. And if they want to use every bit of rules to make their character as powerful as possible, it's really going to be difficult to have those two players, at the end of the day, both have what they wanted. If you have one outlier, it's okay. But if you have a lot of players with really different motivation, it's really going to be difficult to put the game together that everybody enjoy. Luckily, in my experience, most players want to be the best they can be. They are power gamers, and they want to have the best characters possible. Do you have some closing thoughts? Because we're going to take questions, and that's about it.
No, I don't really have any amazing closing thoughts. So throw as many questions as you've got at us. Let's use that time. Oh, yes, it's balance of fun. A wise man once said that, and I'm running with that.
Okay, I have a question regarding meta rewards, generally regarding meta layer of games of fun. Specifically regarding the cooperation of GM and the players. Namely, there's the phenomenon of rating monsters as challenge ratings. So you have a challenge in defeating the monsters, whereas there's a different point of view to it, where instead of players being challenged by the DM, they're telling the same story. So what's your opinion on that? Do you view the game as more of a challenge-based or more of a story-based, so a GM can wing stuff so to tell the same stories as the player, or as the player want to tell the story, instead of just strictly following the challenge, so you didn't succeed in the challenge and fuck, sorry.
I think a lot of that depends on what game you're playing and what players you've got. I mean, I think there are players who genuinely enjoy having a game where the DM isn't trying to tell a traditional story in which people face incredible danger and hardship but eventually succeed at the end. I think there are some players who really like the idea of the DM as essentially this magical computer that is just simulating this world, and if they try to fight a dragon when they shouldn't, then it's going to kill them without any, like, there are players who really enjoy that kind of challenge and enjoy that kind of experience. I'm not one of them, but I know they exist. And you know, when you're a DM, you better know if your players feel like that, and you better know whether all of them feel that way or if some of them feel that way. And if some of them feel that way, you should probably have a discussion about, well, how are we going to handle this? Do you want me to, you know, fudge dice rolls for one person but not for you because you don't like that? Do we need to just play separate games? You also brought up the subject of sort of meta tools to, you know, give the player advice on, you know, what's appropriate. So challenge ratings and stuff like, well, you know, players of this level should have X amount of treasure in order to be... I am pretty much always for that sort of thing because you can always ignore it. None of, you know, so long as that isn't built into the rules in such a way that other stuff just totally falls apart if you don't follow it, it's always useful to give DMs information on what the rest of the rules kind of expect. So, you know, a challenge rating is not, you know, it's not a you can't send this this challenge level of a monster against, you know, you can't send a CR 13 monster against a level 5 party. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. It's just the rules saying, all right, given the abilities that these players are going to have, they're probably not going to defeat this thing. Do with that information as you judge best. So I like having that sort of thing in pretty much any rule set. I think it never does much harm.
I had the luck of having players that enjoy winning. And fudging dice robs them of that feeling. That they really liked killing Drow Elf sorceress after she killed them twice in the same manner. So the point that is important to take, it's important to know what the players want and not the character motivation and that so on. That's another layer. That's how good a game is objectively. But that's not important. It's game. It should be fun. Well, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Thank you for coming and see you later.